So let me start with a small chant and then we can proceed. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Tamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. The office holders and the librarian and all the people here, thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, I would love to go and speak in a Theosophical Society because I have a similar background, because my master also came from the Himalayas. I'm especially thankful that the name of this place is Blavatsky Lodge, one of those people I really admire. So, what I chanted just now, it comes from the Upanishads. The Upanishads are among the earliest literature on spiritual development available to us. They are part of the Vedas. The last section of the Vedas, therefore they are called Vedanta. Anta means end. No? Even in Telugu. Sanskrit, Anta means end. So Vedanta means end of the Vedas, which means the last portion of the Vedas. This is Vedanta. So this particular sloka that I chanted, if you notice carefully, Sahana Vavatu, Sahanau Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karavavahai. So there's one word which keeps occurring in all three lines. That word, Saha. Saha, Sahana Vavatu, Sahanau Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karavavahai. See the Saha, 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 which means what we are learning or what we learn sitting before a teacher, I'm not talking about me, but about a teacher, is between you and me. It's not just Sahana Vavatu, may both of us be protected. Every mantra, every sloka from the ancient texts has innumerable meanings attached to this. So when you start a satsang, or when you start a dialogue, or when you start a talk on spiritual matters, and also when you start spiritual training, I don't know if you have thought about it, you need protection. So the first sentence is Sahana Bhavatu. Protection from what? First, protection from the vagaries of nature. So sit in a place where there is no earthquake or wind blowing or something falling on you, when there are no crawling creatures around. So first thing was physical, asking for protection. The protection not only for me, but for you, both of us, which is why the word Saha is used. Protect, may we, you and I, be protected. The other protection is psychological protection. May we be protected from disturbances. May you and I be protected from distractions, mind distractions as well as those which affect the mind or which may be beyond the mind. There are some places you go and sit there and try to meditate, you cannot. For all you know, there may not be any loud music, nobody is talking, but you just cannot meditate. There are places. Why? Because there are other forces of nature at play about which we don't know much about, generally. And therefore this is also means protect me from these disturbances, protect me from these interventions, protect me so that I can meditate and find out the truth. You and I. If you need protection, I also need protection, right? So, this is Sahana Bhavatu. The next sentence is Sahanau Bhunaktu. May you and I be nourished. Now, nourishment again, there is physical nourishment, there is mind nourishment, and there is spiritual. I'm deliberately separating spiritual from mind nourishment. Physical nourishment, you all know. Eat food, not too much, not too little. Try and eat food in which you don't involve in causing injury to other living beings. Food that doesn't cause trouble in your digestive system, simple food at the right time, and so on. You know that. And good water, pure water. We are in Kali Yuga, so water is also sold these days. Nothing is free. Anyway, so good food, nutritious food, good water, and so on. May we be nourished. Then the other side, mind and intellectual nourishment. May we be nourished by good thoughts. May we be nourished with one-pointed attention. And may we not be distracted and learn wrong things. May my intelligence, the last sentence of the Gayatri Mantra, Dhyo yona prachodayat, may my intelligence be stimulated, which means nourished. So, this is the second nourishment. Then spiritual nourishment. Very often we sit down and try to gather our thoughts. It doesn't happen. The more you try to gather, the more the mind runs away. What you need is spiritual nourishment, which means there are other forces beyond our understanding, which are spiritual in nature, of which some are not spiritual in nature and some are spiritual in nature. Not spiritual in nature always try to distract us. This is the first sentence, may we be protected. Those which take us towards the spiritual understanding are the good forces. Here we are asking, may we be nourished by these good energies. Energies, entities, whatever you want to call them. And one of the best things for that is to sit near a spiritual being so that all these things are kept at bay. So, Sahanao bhunaktu, may we be nourished. Sahaviryam karavavahai, may the vitality in us remain and not diminish. No vitality. In the ancient teachings, the student goes to the teacher, the expression used is with fuel in his hand. Some people mistake that he burns a piece of stick and takes it, which is symbolic, of course. What he means is that when you learn, when you go deep into the understanding of the spiritual, you need energy to do that. Virya is vitality to do that. Spirituality is not something that you learn when you're retired, when there is no vitality left to apply one's mind to. It will start when there is true vitality. But there are some people, I'm not talking about physical age, okay? Where I know people 16 years old who are already old. And I know people who are 85 years old who are quite young. What I mean to say is the vitality involved in having a fresh mind to understand. That we're not stereotyped and put into a box. You see? It's okay. So, therefore, the idea here is, the prayer is, may my vitality, and also that my vitality be used for understanding what I am studying, because this is not a joke or a hobby, the spiritual practice. You need to get complete one-pointed attention of all your energies into this. It's not a hobby. Right? I have everything, but I also have the spiritual rose in my jacket. No. It's your priority, first priority. So therefore, you need energy. It's tremendous energy is required. So may my virya increase. May I, not mine, yours, mine, both of us. Tejasvinavadi tamastu. May the inner fire of tapasya be ignited in us. I know you realize that the Latin word igne has the same root as agni. Okay? You can't even start your car or scooter without an ignition switch. Igne, so may this light, the tejas, the fire of spiritual fulfillment, the fire of spiritual quest, the fire of sacrifice into which you offer everything, be alive in you and me. So, Tejasvina ma vidvishava. This is an important statement at the end. May we not fight with each other. This is to distinguish between a dialogue and an argument. When it's an argument, you have already concluded, okay, this is my system. And I have concluded, this is my system. And we are trying to convince each other, we can never meet. Then it becomes a quarrel rather than an understanding, rather than a dialogue. While a dialogue is when you and I sit together and look at the problem and see how I can solve this, how we can solve this. This is a dialogue, a samvad in Sanskrit. The first word of samvad is sama, which means both people are given equal rights to discuss the matter. So, this is the mantra I started with. So when all these things are in place, then begins the study of that which is beyond ordinary understanding. And it's not something that we need to search for far away, because it's right inside us. Somebody said, it's nearer to you than your own neck vein. This is the search. Traditionally, this is the search. But there's one thing I need to point out. We know that I was with a master who was from the Himalayas. Maheshwarnath Babaji belonged to the Natha Sampradaya, one of the traditions. I was with him, and he completely understood the fact that the founder of the Theosophical Society, HPB, was a student of one or more advanced masters. We were more than convinced about it. We used to have several discussions on this matter. In fact, he even said that he knew one of them, because in the spiritual field, this is not politics, so there are no two parties, right? They're all together trying to do something. But one may go in one way, another may go another way, but they're all trying to bring things together, which is also your motto here. Satyat nasti paro dharma. There is no greater dharma than the truth. So there are different ways of looking at the truth. Now, having come to the subject, there's something very important which is often missed. Everybody wants to practice. People jump into practices, plunge into practices without knowing why they are going, where are they going, what is all this about. Now, this is very dangerous. HPB has warned this several times. And before you start any kind of practice, be clear about your map. Where are you going? Why are you going? Which way are you going? And I think it is also important, at least in the beginning, to be guided by somebody who has walked the path. When I say this, I mean it's largely unexplored, uncharted territory. You can find it on your own, of course. It may take several lives. You may have many stumbling blocks. But if you have someone who has walked on the path, then there's less chance of falling off, more chances of moving forward. This is to be noted. In Indian philosophy, yoga is a complete darshana by itself. There is Sankhya Darshana, Sankhya teachings, Vedanta Darshana, Vedantic teachings, Nyaya Darshana, the teachings of Nyaya, and so on. And the last one is the Yoga Darshana. There is Mimamsa, Purva Mimamsa. Let's not go into this. Then the last one is the Yoga Darshana, although most of the terms in the Yoga Darshana are derived from Sankhya. Tattvas, stages, Kaivalya, the ultimate culmination. These are all terms from the Sankhya of Kapila Munis. And Kapila certainly is recognized as one of the greatest teachers, because even in the Gita, Krishna is made to say, among the Munis, I am Kapila. So, from there comes yoga. I am referring, because what I just spoke is linked in some way. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is of course, but please remember they are sutras. Now sutras are aphorisms. You need an interpreter to understand aphorisms. If somebody simply says, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha, what does it mean? What is Chitta and what is Nirodha and what is Vritti? So all these things these are sutras. So a teacher has to explain it, open it up and talk about it. Now, I'm saying this because in the Yoga Sutras, there are 4 chapters. Please understand. First chapter is not practice. The first chapter, which is called the Samadhipada, is a chapter that deals with the blueprint. What is Samadhi? What does it mean? Where are you going? What is the path towards it? And so on. And why one needs to understand Samadhi. What are the different stages of Samadhi which lead to Kaivalya or freedom. This is the first chapter, not practice. Only when one has fully understood this, one goes, well, you can practice yogasanas, that's okay. In Hollywood, everybody is doing yogasanas now. You get a good shapely body, all that is fine, but I'm talking about serious yoga, not just yogasanas. So it's called Samadhipada. So this is a theoretical, complete understanding of what Samadhi is, the culmination which leads to freedom, which is Kaivalya. It is in the second chapter that practice comes, which is the Sadhanapada. Sadhana is practice. Please understand, nobody jumps to chapter 2 without chapter 1, right? And then, having known the first and the second, when you go to the third chapter, which is Vibhutipada, which means the extraordinary capacities that occur to an individual who is going through the practice. But then, quickly one goes to the next chapter because that's not so important. You go out of that and then you come to the Kaivalyapada, which is freedom. The word Kaivalya comes from the Sanskrit word Kevala, only, which means the yogi quickly discovers that there is only one, there are no two. The whole problem begins when there are two. There is only one Purusha. Now when you say Purusha, don't think it's male. Purusha is the spirit, the supreme all-pervading reality. When the yogi's mind is completely quiet, when all his distractions are removed, all disturbances are gone, then the mind in its calmness first experiences some capacities, and if you start indulging in them, you will not move forward. For instance, suddenly you will find that you can read your boss's mind. You stay with that, then you'll have to read the boss's wife's mind, and so on and so forth. and there will be a line of people coming to find out what's my future. That's it, you're stuck. So from Vibhuti-pada to the Kaivalya-pada, where there is no you and I, but there's only one reality. This is Kaivalya. One realizes, and that is reached when one is in Samadhi. Now there are different ways of Samadhi. Samadhi simply means a state where the mind is tranquil and quiet, sama. Now that is the tarmac from which you take off to the higher levels. There's much more to go. So this is what we are trying to do in some way. And the other thing to remember, that in all ancient teachings of world religions, there is a link to this. I must say that in India, it's a little more comprehensive, because at a period when most people were trying to improve materially and so on, or conquering other nations, here was a dedicated band of people trying to study the mind and what is beyond the mind. So naturally we have a comprehensive system, a lot of things which have been studied, which does not mean that there are no gems of truth in other religious traditions. I fully understand this. If you study this carefully, you will find this. But the establishment and the organization cover it up very successfully. So you see only the organization, you don't see the truth, you see. I also had the privilege of being with J. Krishnamurti for some years, close to him during the last years of his life. I left because I don't fully agree with this new religion called the Krishnamurtite, which is why I left, because I was on the board of the trust and so on and so forth. Certain things, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? All right, you throw out the bathwater, but there's still the baby there. So, some points of disagree. Doesn't matter, they are good people. We are all good people. So, so Krishnaji had this story which he used to repeat very often. With the story of two friends. One of them was the devil himself, Satan. Satan and his good friend went for a walk, and then suddenly the devil bent down and picked up something from the lawn and put it in his pocket. So his friend asked him, "What did you pick up just now?" So the devil said, "I just picked up the truth." And his friend said, "If you have picked up the truth and put it in your pocket, your days are numbered, because you are the opposite. This is of truth, your untruth, your darkness. If you put it in your pocket, your days are numbered." And the devil smiled and tapped him on his shoulders and said, "Don't worry, friend, I'll organize it." You know what I mean? While I fully understand that organizations are required to carry on certain factors and certain things, when the organization structure becomes more important than the truth, we are stuck. You see this? So that's where we are. This is what I wanted to talk to you about. I have been associated in many ways with the Theosophical Society itself. Not as an official member, but keenly studying what's going on, because I also have a master who is in some way linked to the masters who started the Theosophical. I don't know if many people know that in the south of India there was a great yogi called, a complicated name, Tiruvarul Perum Jyoti Ramalinga Swamigal. A little complicated. Tiruvarul Perum Jyoti means the supreme light and so on. Ramalinga was his name. He predicted 20 years before HPB arrived in India that there is a disciple of the Himalayan masters who is coming to India to start a movement for the truth. And he said that you guys, you can't, maybe when she says you will understand. Because we give a lot of importance to something that is imported, right? The jasmine in your own garden doesn't smell so good, in other garden smells good. Anyway, so, and this is interesting because this Ramalinga Swamigal, in the last part of his life, when he passed away, nobody knows when he passed away, he shut himself up in a small room for 3 days. This is a very well authentic, well, now you have to take my words, but this happened many years ago. And 3 days later, when they opened the room, they only found his cloth there. He was not there. The Vajrayana Buddhists call it the rainbow body, whatever you want to call it. He was not there, his body was not there. So when he left, he had left a note. They found his white cloth, which he used to cover himself with, and a small note. And the note said, I had opened a shop, but there were no buyers. So I wrapped it up and here I go. This is how it was. Anybody knows Tamil here? He said, Kadai viruttom, kolvar illai kattikondom. So, truth is often not palatable because it has its realities, which may not be all hunky-dory. Needs to work on it and go beyond all our prejudices. So, I rest my case.
Namaskar, Shriya. So, my question regarding the energies that provide us influence and our spiritual guidance, as you were discussing earlier. I remember reading in your book, The Sequel to Apprentice to Himalayan Master, The Journey Continues, that you have a chapter dedicated on how the rishis came on to Mount Kailash. They came from another realm and disseminated spirituality, metaphysical information to humanity, all across different cultures. And my question is regarding the Sanskrit language. Many say the Sanskrit language is a light language.
Is that?
A light language that was not invented by humans.
A light?
Light language.
Light.
Light language. So my question is, did the Sanskrit language come from another realm, another civilization beyond our earth? And if so, is it the mother also of all Indo-European languages? So my question is, was it invented by the rishis or by some other group that were not human? Thank you.
Well, you're asking a question to a person who believes that life exists not only on this earth. Okay? There are many realms, this is a vast universe. Can we say that life exists only in this little puny little thing? No. First understand this. So therefore there are many worlds, there are many planes, there are many, now people are beginning to say there is life on exoplanets which are similar to the earth and so on, but light years away, so we don't know when we'll know this about. Unless you have some way of leaving your body and traveling, then you might find out. You don't need worry about the time, right? Time, space. And let's not discuss that. It might appear like fiction to you. Okay. But therefore my understanding is the present Sanskrit, which we call the Devanagari. The word Devanagari means language of the gods. Now in ancient times one could not understand higher beings, so you call them Devas because they had many powers which we didn't have. Right? So I think that the present Sanskrit is a step down from that language. I think, my understanding, is there was a mother language which gave birth to Sanskrit and sister languages which are similar to Sanskrit in their grammatical structure, like German, for instance, Indo-Germanic languages. In fact, the German grammar is also very difficult, which is why Max Muller find it easy to understand Sanskrit grammar. All those books of the East which he wrote, first translations came with Max Muller. So yes, Sanskrit is an ancient language. It's part of its origin is, of course, beyond this earth, my understanding. However, the Sanskrit that we know now is adopted and adjusted for a particular function. So it may, not may, it does contain some original words which have come from there. This is how I look at it.
Actually, Shriyam, I have a question that's sort of in the same vein. Do you don't mind if I just ask that question? It relates to something that you wrote in your sequel to Apprentice to Himalayan Master.
Which one?
The
journey continues.
The journey.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in some cave in the Himalayan mountains there are artifacts from ancient beings who came to the earth to help humanity evolve. And in fact that two of their bodies still remain there and artifacts. My question is sort of relating to higher consciousness and the control of matter, and also in relation to Nagaraj, who came in the vehicle. So if these beings obviously are very highly technology advanced, I'm assuming they're also spiritually advanced. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit on that, the higher consciousness and the control of matter, but yet still needing physical spaceships to come here, that sort of thing.
You know why I decline to discuss? I'll do it, but this is because there's so much of this literature nowadays on this, especially with the internet. Sometimes I feel some of it may be exaggerated, honestly. But yes, I do believe, because I have my own experience, that there are greater beings. There are realms where, I don't know why we are discussing, anyway, there are realms where great beings live who don't even have a human form. Nagaloka, for instance. And that they have given us some technology which now we are beginning to understand very slowly. Now, for instance, you said that they have vessels like to come here and go. On one hand, some of them, see, there are many beings. Some of them came in the subtle bodies, and there were some who actually came in the. Now, you would say, how is it that a flying vessel, I don't want to use the word flying saucer, it's become very bandied about. So, how is that this vessel suddenly goes up without even a propeller? Like, I have traveled in a copter. The copter also goes up, but it makes such noise that I think if you travel every day, you will go deaf. It's terrible. But here is a silent moving up. Now, how is this possible? What is the fuel? Because you don't see any fuel exhaust. The fact is, imagine that gravity has a certain pole, like north-south, a certain pole, certain charge. We are now sticking onto this earth because we are of the opposite charge. What if there is technology by which you can change the charge of the object? So instead of staying here, it would rather be repelled by the force of gravity and therefore move without fuel. So I have seen some of these things happening. Honestly, you will have to believe. There is no way I can prove it. I can't levitate. So Okay. There are such things.
So you mentioned that samadhi is the first state of some of the more advanced states. Can you talk a bit more about those more advanced states, please?
Correction. I didn't say that samadhi is the first state. I said samadhi is when the mind, all the distractions of the mind are gone, all the opposing conflicts of the mind are resolved, both resolved. Because if the conflicts are not resolved, you cannot have a mind without a disturbance. Impossible, without distraction. And when I say distraction, it means that mind which has been trained to free itself from the distractions also of the sense organs. When this happens, one enters into a contemplative stage where one sees one's own being as the pure being without being crowded by any of these influences. That is the first step. But there are, when you say the word samadhi, it includes all the stages from there up to the state when your ego is totally dissolved, which is called nirvikalpa. And after, no vikalpa means there is no more coming back. All the seeds have been removed. It's called nirbija. There are no seeds left. There is sabija samadhi, which means your mind is calm, but all your desires and distractions have disappeared for the time being. They are in the form of seeds of desire. So when you wake up from the trance, they come back again. Maybe with less strength, but they come back. Nirbija is when all the seeds also have been removed. There are no seeds which can sprout. The mind is that is the highest stage of samadhi that we know of, as human minds know of. There could be much greater levels of standing. You should never stop and say this is the end. You know, it's an infinite journey.
Might I ask a quick second question? I recently met a few people that had done 3 years retreats by themselves in a cave or a meditation room, and yet they felt they hadn't really got that much from it. I suspect one of the things was they were doing a more organized form, which can obscure the truth. But what would be your advice to people that are?
My advice is make your bedroom into a nice cave. There's no point in going. And I mean, don't bring rocks inside, especially if you're married. I'm a married man. So, what I mean is, you need definitely some periods of solitude to delve into your mind. If you can do it in a faraway place in the Himalayas, good. But please understand, it's always good to have a guide, not attempt on your own. Because you attempt on your own, you come across obstacles which you will not be able to cross. This is the problem. I'm not saying that your teacher should stay with you all the time. That's not what I'm saying. But some kind of instruction, some kind of guidance will be of great help when you do this. That may be the problem there. And I decided, I read books and I decided to go in solitude and sit for some time. It's not easy that way. I'm convinced that periods of solitude are essential to move forward. I would personally go through a path where one needs to discipline oneself and go looking for it. You know, it's some great souls might have touched it. Even you may not find a teacher for them, because we look at life only as a small compartment of this life. I personally think there are many lives, And therefore, if you don't find a training or a teacher now, they must have had that at some point in their lives. And now they've come to a place where it is not required. Now, the normal human being cannot imitate this. You need to start somewhere, one needs some guidance before one touches that. Like people, Ramana Maharshi, at the age of 15, had an experience where he saw that he was not the body. Not imagined. He saw that he was not the body. And then his enquiry started, who am I if I am not the body? Right? This is why he said, who am I? So can you reach the state of Ramana Maharshi by sitting down in a chair and saying, who am I? Who am I? Now that's an identity crisis. It's a place where the psychiatrist has to look into this. I don't know who I am. See? But so what I'm trying to say, that what Ramana Maharshi attained in his life, we cannot imitate that. It's a good thought. It's good to find out who I am. I understand. But he had already attained a state where he did not need any help. But most people are not there, so we imitate. It's not possible. And then we find out this is not working, now what to do? The whole idea was that nothing should work. Right? I know somebody who wrote an autobiography called Nothing Ever Happened. Yeah, but how do we do this? It's not possible. You can read it, of course. It happened in somebody's life, but it can't. So give it a thought. No. No. It need not rely upon human transformation, but you said, Krishnamurti said, right, somewhere in your quest.
Yes.
How would you know unless you read Krishnamurti?
Yes.
So, you see that? So sometimes it is required, because what people have felt, they have spoken. Krishnamurti hardly wrote a book. I mean, he spoke, so it was recorded. I think he wrote only 1 or 2 small books which he tried, finished and gave up very fast. Doing that. So I know. So, yes, some people may, this is why I am saying that some people are different from others, all are not the same. There was another great teacher called Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, who was the guru of the well-known Swami Vivekananda, who went west and so on. Now, what I'm trying to say, there are sensitive individuals who probably don't need to read or understand anything. But I think for normally, one needs even to know that there is something, you need to read something or listen to something. So it's not that it is the most important, but information in some way is important. I know when you reach that, you're beyond all information. And in today's world, it's futile to carry too much information in our heads because Google God is there. It may be wrong sometimes, but generally not. So the ultimate idea, of course, even if you learn something, what you learn is how to dispose of what you learned. Very important. You know, there was a person who you would call, in India we call them fakirs. You know, fakir, sometimes even magicians are called fakirs. There was it's like, what is the English word for fakir? An itinerant wanderer, a holy man, a mendicant, whatever. There was one such person who sat in Shirdi, a fakir. And nobody knew he was Hindu, Muslim, nobody knew. He just, sometimes he said Ram, Ram, sometimes he said Allah, Allah, and so on. And nobody thought he has been educated or knew anything about the Upanishads or Vedas or anything of the kind. He always sat like this, with a cloth tied on his head. Okay? So one day, 2 scholars were sitting in front of him and discussing something. about knowledge. He was just sitting there quietly. The subject was, is knowledge important? Two Pandits, of course, people who have studied all this from Maharashtra. Is knowledge important? The other guy said, no, experience is important. You have to discard knowledge. Should we? So suddenly, this man who was listening to this conversation, he piped in. He said, look, 1 second. He said, I have not read all these things, but if you are walking in the garden and there's a thorn that gets stuck in your heel, you get pain. Now you need to get the thorn out. So you may pick up another thorn and pry this out. So after prying it out, do you throw both away or do you stick the second fellow in? What do? He said, well, we throw both away. He said, this is the same thing. Ignorance needs to be removed with knowledge. After it is removed, throw both out. People, they were shocked because they never thought this man who's with a cloth tied around his head sitting there would have known anything about these matters. So how did he know? He didn't study, he didn't. So it is there, but it's very rare. It's very rare. Even if to know about this, we need to know about this guy. So how do you know? By reading or listening. Only thing is, don't give too much importance to this gathering of information. But it has its role, it has its part to play. Now I'm going to say something interesting. There is one of the greatest of the Upanishads. I was imitating somebody and my leg got stuck. There was, I lost it.
An interesting story.
Yeah. There is an Upanishad called the Mundaka Upanishad. It's one of the principal Upanishads. In this Upanishad, a young man goes to a great teacher and asks him, tell me about knowledge. So the teacher says, there are two kinds of knowledge. There is the higher knowledge and there is the lower knowledge. So the student says, the student himself is an accomplished person. He says, okay, so can you give me a list of lower knowledge so that I can be sure that I understand higher knowledge? You give me a list of lower knowledge, I'll avoid it. Then I'll understand the higher knowledge. You will be shocked. This is from the Upanishad, Shruti. I am not saying this. The list starts like this. Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, Atharvana Veda, Jyotisha, the whole system that we think is required to understand. The truth is listed out as lower knowledge. So this guy is totally confused. So he says, so what is higher knowledge? So the teacher says the higher knowledge is that which leads you to the truth. Now, 1 second. Which does not mean that you are not supposed to study this. You study it with the understanding that is leading you to that which is beyond. You see, for instance, if I didn't read the Mundaka Upanishad, how would I know that this is there? I wouldn't. So, what they're trying to say is, even if you know all these things, if it is not leading you to the truth, it's lower knowledge. Not that you should. I hope you get what we are trying to say. So, in the same Upanishad, in one place, the Rishi says that those who have read everything, but who have not understood, which means still in the lower knowledge, when they become teachers, they are like You would have thought that this particular thing I'm going to say comes from Shakespeare. No. 2000 years ago, the Mundaka Upanishad says such teachers like Andhai naiva niyamana yatandaha, like the blind leading the blind. Yeah. Can I also little bit more talk on this a bit? It is important. It's important. There was a great man called Ganapati Shastri. He was a famous poet and a great scholar and a Sri Vidya Upasaka. Nowadays it's become a problem with me. Anybody who meets me suddenly pops up, can you teach me Sri Vidya? So he was all this put together. And then he felt that with all these things, he was known as Kavyakanta Ganapati Shastri, which means Ganapati, who is a great scholar. His name was Ganapati. And Kavyakanta, jewel of poets and so on. Big man. But he always felt that with all this knowledge and learning and tantra and everything, there was some obstacle between him and the truth. There was something which was barring him from understanding the truth. So he was in the search of a teacher who would kind of help him get out of this. He went to Tiruvannamalai. Somebody told him, this Ramana Maharshi was unknown at that time. Somebody told him, on the cave up there is a young man sitting there. He looks like a rishi. Perhaps he can solve your problem. So he went up. When he went up, Ramana was sitting with his eyes open, but he didn't see him. His eyes were open, but they were not registering anything. Have you seen any one picture, anybody of Ramana Maharshi with closed eyes? No. There was no going in or coming out. So, he was sitting there. Long time he waited. Must say that he was very patient for being a famous man. And then he looked at him, zeroed in on him. And then this man said, prostrations to you. Then he did this. You know, Ramana Maharshi hardly talked. He didn't speak much. So he put his hand up, like, which means what? What do you want? In India, this is a gesture. What do you want? He was waiting for this signal. He started. It took him 10 minutes or 15 minutes to finish. I did this, I did that, I studied this, I studied that, I did this. The whole thing like a verbal diarrhea. The whole thing came out. And then he asked him, now what should I do? This is a typical, beautiful answer from Ramana Maharshi. He said, for 5 minutes, can you just shut up? You know what? In Tamil, he said, "Konja neram chumma irukka mudiyuma." Can you just shut up for a while? Keep quiet. Because he's got so much caught up in his knowledge and so on, that the mind doesn't have any rest. If the mind doesn't rest, how will it touch the truth? So when you listen to Krishnamurti, you must also take it that way. It's not that you should do this or that, but you should understand that ultimately it has all to go and become quiet. This is what we're trying to say. People may say, I know, I've lived with him, we have said, you know, I didn't have a recorder at that time, anyway they wouldn't have let me record it. I wish I had. I am witness to a statement from Krishnamurti. I said that at the National Convention in Adyar. He said, K never denied the masters. What do you say? He said, yes, he denied the caricatures they had made out of them. But K never denied them. When somebody wanted to talk, he said, shut up. Darling, you don't know anything about it. Don't talk. So there are many things to look. There was one more question.
Namaste, Shri I would just like to ask, can you get nirvana, moksha, liberation, salvation just by the practice of bhakti yoga? If you just stick to that path, is it possible?
Now this cannot be answered in such a short while. We need to go into understanding what is bhakti. You know what normal bhakti is? Going to a temple or a church or whatever and saying, can I get a promotion? Please give me, I don't have children, can you give me a child? This is the normal bhakti. We consider this to be bhakti. Or doing puja, right? And saying every day, I enjoy this puja, so I am a bhakta, right? Or I'm singing some songs and I'm enjoying it, so this is my bhakti. All good. I'm not saying now, but when you're talking about that bhakti by which you touch, it's not called nirvana, it's a culmination, darsana. This is a serious affair. If one has that kind of bhakti, then I think you can go ahead without doing anything else. But please, I want to tell you, if you want to do that, my suggestion is read a little text called the Narada Bhakti Sutras. Okay? And I also want to tell you a story about this kind of bhakti. This bhakti does not expect any profit or material gain. When you say bhakti, it means devotion. In the Mahabharata, there is a space, there is a place where Krishna, after the war is over, is going back to Dwaraka. He says, I'm going. So he goes and meets everybody to say bye. He doesn't just vanish, he says bye. He's a very friendly guy. And then, to people who are his age, he embraces them. To people who are elders, he touches their feet. How many of our so-called spiritual people will touch elders' feet? Tell me. Usually their ego becomes super. He touches the older one's feet. This is why he is called avatar. Greatness comes with humility. Touches their feet. And then there is Kunti, who is the matriarch of the family. He goes there and touches her feet. Expression used is, take the dust from her feet. And he says, I'm going off to Dwaraka. Ask me for any boon or blessing you want. I can give it to you now, because I'll be gone afterwards. So there's a beautiful lecture given by Kunti. Very interesting. She says, listen, you are saying I'm going away. Don't try this drama on me. Because you don't go, you don't come, I know you. I know who you are, what you are. Don't give me this, I'm going away. You're not going anywhere. I know that. Plus, you started the war. Then you joined our party and we won the war. All this is you're doing and you're saying now I'm going. Where are you going? You're not going anywhere. Okay, you ask me, ask for anything and I will give it to you. I have one boon to ask of you. What? Bring all the sorrows of the world on my head. Read the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad. Bring all the sorrows of the world on my head. Even Krishna is taken aback. What kind of blessing is this? This is why? Because it's only when sorrow comes that human beings call on God, generally. So when one sorrow comes, you will call me. I know that if I call, you will appear before me. I have no doubt about that. So sorrows keep coming, I keep calling, you keep appearing. What more do I want? You're saying you're going off to Dwarka, right? No, you will be here with me. This is what I want. This is bhakti. How many bhaktas are there like this? If that is there, you don't need Vedanta, you don't need yoga, you need nothing.
are you happy to take any more questions, Shreya?
No, sorry.
Okay, we're finished for the day.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been absolutely
Takes a lot of energy to.
Yes, of course. Of course it does. Yes, it does. And I was very, I don't know, pleased is the right word to say that you mentioned last night that sometimes you get nervous too. So
Yeah.
so,
I do.
human. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely wonderful, an absolute pleasure that you've taken the time out of your busy schedule to come and spend some time with us here.
My privilege.
So you've been very busy. So thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Please thank you.
Sorry I couldn't take any more questions. Pardon me.